Okay, on this problem, maybe you can see while you're recording. Okay, let's see if I can share my screen. All right, I wanted to go over the extra credit for Chapter 3. Chapter 3, the last section, is really dealing with aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and then also dealing with this new model we call the ASAD model. And all it is how to make a prediction about how certain things will influence the economy. And those certain things are going to be monetary policy and fiscal policy. So for the exam, make sure that you have a good understanding of what monetary and fiscal policy are. I've got a list of them here. There's expansionary policy and contractionary policy, and they're broken out into monetary policy and fiscal policy. Yeah, I misspelled that, expansionary. Remember that these things right here, monetary policy, where you buy bonds, buy means bigger. When you buy bonds, you make the money supply bigger, which makes the interest rates lower. Or what the Fed can do is they can lower the required reserve ratio, they can lower the discount window, or they can lower the interest paid on reserves. These four tools right here are monetary policy to expand the economy, to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Right? When you shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, let me go to the whiteboard for this. If we are, and the problem says that we are currently in a recessionary gap, right? From the aggregate demand, aggregate supply chapters, what you learned is that there are two aggregate supply curves. There's a short run aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping. This is short, that's S, run, aggregate, and supply. All right. There's also a long run aggregate supply curve. And know the reasons why the short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. It's basically because of sticky wages. And that just means that if, for example, I produce a good and that good is selling for $5, and then I have inflation, the price level rises and the good starts to sell for 10. If all prices rose automatically, meaning the price of the good that I sold doubled and the wages I paid to my team doubled, then I would have no motive to produce more, because it just means everything's relative. If all prices rise by the same amount, I still have the same amount of money, all right? So I can still have the same purchasing power that I did before. But let's assume that wages are sticky. And that's what John Maynard Keynes said. He said wages are sticky. And because wages are sticky, when all prices rise except for wages, there's now an opportunity for a producer to make more profit. And when producers can make more profit as the prices rise, and that's what we have on this axis, we have the price level, which is just inflation. On this, we actually have GDP, right? And it's real GDP, and we know it's real GDP because we're monitoring by prices. And so with sticky wages, if prices are stuck, wages are stuck because of a contract is what the book talks about. There are different theories, but focus primarily on the sticky wages theory. If wages are stuck, then I have a motive. When the price level goes up, I have a motive to increase my aggregate supply. That's why the short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. The long run aggregate supply curve, which is really our potential output, we like to say, or this is where if we got down to full employment, which is not necessarily zero employment, this is our long run aggregate supply curve. And all it says is there's only so much stuff we can produce. It doesn't matter what the price level is. It doesn't matter how much people want to buy. There's only a certain amount of goods and services that can be produced in the United States with our land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So here, the long run aggregate supply curve is strictly vertical because it's not impacted by the price level. It is what it is. We produce whatever we're going to produce, all right? The aggregate demand curve slopes downward. Please know the 3 reasons for those are in the book also. And so if the problem told me I am in a recessionary gap, it means that in the short run equilibrium, where the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve intersect, it's going to be to the left, right? To the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. If my aggregate demand curve were right here, which it's not, let me see if I were to draw it right here, right? This would be an example of long run equilibrium because the aggregate demand curve is intersecting the long run aggregate supply curve, right? But that's not the case. The problem says specifically, this is the aggregate demand curve. that we are in a short run recessionary gap, all right? We could either be in a recessionary gap, which means we are on the left side of the short run aggregate supply curve. And what I mean is this is our current output, right? If we were to come down here, we are at Y, and I think I asked you to label it Y sub 1, meaning this is where we currently are producing. Here on the long run aggregate supply curve, I want you to label that Y sub F so that you understand that that output is when everyone is working, and not necessarily everyone, but we get down to our natural rate of unemployment, all right? And then this is our current price level right here. And our price level is just inflation. So when you see an increase in the number on the left axis here, that's an increase in the price level. And in this example, the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, that just means there's an increase in inflation. Price level and inflation are synonymous. Okay, so this is an example of a recessionary gap. And we know that because where we are currently, Y sub 1, is less than where we could be, our potential. Right? If we were somewhere on this side, meaning that the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve intersected to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve, then we'd be in an inflationary gap. This is a recessionary gap, right? And the reason it makes a difference whether you're in a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap, it makes a difference on what policies to use. Because if we go back to what we had before on our policies, because we are in a recessionary gap, we want to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. We are in a recession, therefore we want to practice expansionary measures. We can either do monetary expansionary policy or we can do fiscal expansionary policy. Remember, monetary policy is controlled and dictated by the Federal Reserve Bank. Fiscal policy is more like taxing and spending. All right, so let me get back to the problem. All right, so the problem then goes on to state and this is our last extra credit problem. Let's see. All right, I'm going to skip back. So we did that. We've just completed this. Draw a correctly labeled graph. All right, full employment. And this is in chapter 34, like your most recent chapter. All right, define full employment. Full employment is just the natural rate of unemployment, meaning that we get down to our natural rate of unemployment, which the book mentions is somewhere in between the numbers of 4 and 6%. The natural rate of unemployment, we will never get to zero unemployment, which is this part right here, simply because there will always be someone looking for a job. That is frictional unemployment. There'll always somebody who just graduated who's looking for a job, or there will always be someone who has moving across country, perhaps, has a spouse and has decided to change and move to wherever they're going for. And remember, frictional employment is a job matching piece. Okay, so that's answering A and B. All right, D, assume the Federal Reserve targets the federal funds rate to reach full employment. Okay, so the book talks about this. It talks about in chapter 34, the latest chapter, the Fed dictates the discount rate. But what it does is it targets the federal funds rate. Do not get confused between the two. The discount rate is the rate of interest that the Fed charges banks for overnight lending when they cannot meet their required reserve ratio. The Fed funds rate, on the other hand, is the interbank, and this is the rate that banks charge each other. Right? So if the Fed wants to lower these rates, what they'll do is they'll push and pump a lot of money into the economy. When there's a lot of money into the economy, they've expanded the money supply. That's going to decrease the interest rate. When it decreases the interest rate, it's going to make it cheaper for people to borrow. When people can borrow cheaply, then we know that businesses are going to invest because low interest rates means there's an increase in investment. When there's an increase in investment, there'll be an increase in gross domestic product. And then you need to know furthermore from chapter 33 that there's a multiplier effect, which is what it's talking about here. So assume the Federal Reserve targets the new Fed funds rate to reach full employment. Should they go higher or lower? They definitely want to go lower because we are in a recessionary gap. What they want to do is they want to lower the Fed funds rate. Given the Federal Reserve action you defined, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effects on the nominal interest rate. what I was looking for in this one, right? And again, this is the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So let me clear this. The other model or market we learned was the money market, right? And what you learned is there's a money supply curve, which is just a vertical line, all right? And so on this axis, we have the interest rate. So how much money is out there? It depends, whatever the Fed wants. The Fed dictates the money supply. They control the money supply. So if they want to increase it, they're going to shift it to the right. If they want to decrease it, they're going to shift it to the left. We also have a money demand curve, which is downward sloping. However, can be somewhat horizontal. So this is the money demand curve. The money demand curve will move because of a change in price or a change in output, right? How much money people want to hold, right? Because remember, the money demand curve is how much money do you want to hold? It's not how much money do you have or how much money do you want to make. How much of your assets do you want to hold in current dollars, all right? If I normally hold $5 every day, if the price level rises, right? If all prices go up, then it makes sense. I'm probably going to hold more cash in my wallet, all right? Because prices have gone up. Or if my income goes up, right? When I make $50 a week, I don't hold $1,000 in my wallet. However, if I made $200,000 a year, I might hold more money. So if P, price level, or Y, my income go up, then this whole curve is going to shift to the right. It's going to shift upwards. Or if these go down, shifts downwards because I don't need to hold on to as much money, right? Or if GDP rises, and GDP is just P times Y. So if both of these go up, then the curve will shift up or it will shift down. Where these two curves intersect is our current interest rate. So when it said that the Fed wanted to target the Fed funds rate, what they're going to do is they're going to buy bonds, right? When they buy bonds, they will be taking bonds out of the economy and pumping cash into the economy. And there's a great video that I published called How the Fed Works, where they actually show in the video like a gasoline tank pumping money into the economy. So when they inject money in the economy, this curve right here, the money supply curve, and this is MS, money supply curve, and remember it's completely vertical. This is the money demand curve, are going to shift to the right. When they shift to the right, the interest rate is R, is going to fall, and I know it's going to fall because I have a new R. We're MS1, this is MS1, the new money supply curve, right? And remember, it shifted to the right because the Fed bought bonds, right? They did some sort of expansionary monetary policy. They're putting more money in the economy, which means the cost of borrowing money goes down. That's going to lower the interest rates, right? And John Maynard Keynes pointed out, low interest rates means that there's going to be an increase, that's an increase, or an upward arrow, in investment, right? When there's an increase in investment, it's not dollar for dollar. Remember, there's the multiplier effect, right? So if the government decides to pump money into the economy, let's say to build a highway, then the guys who are working on the highway are going to have cash in their pockets. If they have cash in their pockets, they're going to get more haircuts, which means the guy who gives haircuts is going to be able to get his car washed, which means the guy who washes cars is going to have more money. That's the multiplier effect. A dollar does not just disintegrate when you use it. That person gets to use it. And that multiplier effect is what this last chapter is talking about that you can actually get. All right. So again, when the money supply curve is shifted to the right, when we are on the money demand curve, and notice here, this piece right here, and I mentioned this earlier, this is called the money demand curve. The money demand curve can be perfectly horizontal. And when it is horizontal, like let's say down in this portion, let's say we started here at this MS1 and the Fed wanted to increase the money supply and we went to, let's say, MS2, assuming this is a straight line, right? If we went to MS2, notice because this line here, this money demand curve is completely horizontal, right? Let's assume this is a straight line, right? No curve in it whatsoever, it's a straight line, right? If it's a straight line, it means the interest rate doesn't change. It was R1 before, it will remain R1 afterwards, which means that this is called a liquidity trap. That's where monetary policy is no longer effective, all right? This problem did not necessarily say this, but I know the book does talk about a liquidity trap, and this is what a liquidity trap is, all right? So let me clear that, make sure I'm answering all the questions. Let's go back and look at the questions. Okay, so we just did that. We drew a correctly labeled graph of the money market and showed the effect of the interest rates. What we showed is that the interest rates actually fall. Right? Assume the policymakers pursue a fiscal policy rather than monetary policy. So instead of doing monetary policy, we're going to do fiscal policy. Fiscal policy were those three, where they could either manipulate the taxes, they can manipulate government spending, or they can manipulate the transfers that are paid out. This problem says specifically that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.6 and the value of the recessionary gap is 400 points. All right. The reason this is important is the book tells you how to solve for this, as well as inside of Aplia, I also posted a formula sheet. All right, when you are in here, very detailed formula sheet. And I believe when you go into and this is a formula sheet that I have from a different book, all right? However, I like the formula sheet because all the formulas are on one page. Not all of these formulas necessarily apply. But if you come through here, what I have highlighted are the ones that apply to this chapter. So there's the marginal propensity to consume, which is what we learned, 1 minus MPS and 1 minus MPC. Also, net exports minus imports. There are two types of inflation, cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. The book talks about it. When you have cost push inflation, that's when you'll have the hyperinflation. This is actually what I'm doing right now. I'm just explaining something we've already gone over. All right, but here, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC. So that is my multiplier. And so if I want to know the total change in spending, I can take my multiplier times my initial change in aggregate spending or injection, right? I know that I have a gap of 400. All right, so I have a shortfall of 400. So I need to figure out how much stimulus I need to take my shortfall, which is 400, and I need to divide my shortfall by my multiplier. Well, my multiplier, the formula for my multiplier was given up here, 1 over 1 minus MPC. So if I have, let's calculate my multiplier first. I have 1 divided by 1 minus 0.6. Let's see if this works correctly. It may not. No. All right. So I have 1 divided by 1 minus 0.6 is 0.4. So let's just divide 1 by 0.4, which tells me that my multiplier is 2.5. What that means is for every dollar increase in investment or government spending, or even exports for that one, for every increase in government spending, every dollar increase, I can expect the aggregate demand curve to actually go over by 2.5. Right, so if I could go back to the whiteboard here, if this is my ADAS model, remember I had my long run aggregate supply curve here, and I had my aggregate demand curve here, my short run aggregate supply curve here. All right, I'm not going to label them here, but this is my aggregate demand curve. Here's my short run aggregate supply. Here's my long run aggregate supply. All right, this gap right here is exactly 400, right? They tell you that in this problem. They're like, you're in a recessionary gap. We need to move the aggregate demand curve by 400. If I stimulate the economy and increase government spending by 400, I would actually move this aggregate demand curve not just to here, but because of the multiplier effect, it would move way over here. I would overshoot. Therefore, I don't need to inject 400 X dollars into the economy. What I can do instead is I can, according to the formula sheet here, I only need to inject my shortfall divided by my multiplier. Let me make sure I'm sharing this. All right, I need to take my 400 divided by my multiplier. I know that my shortfall is 400, my multiplier is 2.5. So here, and you cannot see my calculator. All right, I don't know how to share it, but what I do have is 400. All right, let me see if I can share my calculator. Yes, there we go. I have that 400 divided by 2.5. My shortfall divided by my multiplier gives me my desired fiscal stimulus, which is exactly 160. So we do not need to invest more than 860 in it. More than 400. We need to only invest 160 in government spending or investment, right? Now, if it is a tax, right, which the problem goes on to say, so here the answer to F is 160. Right? If the government changes its spending without changing taxes to eliminate or calculate the minimum required change in government spending. We just did that. If the government changes taxes, so instead of doing spending here, we're now going to do taxes. All right? Taxes are something completely different. And the book mentions this. It says, because of the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save, when you give someone a tax break, they don't necessarily consume every single dollar. There's a propensity or a probability they're going to save something. So if the government wanted to increase aggregate demand by, let's say, $5, if they gave the $5 in tax cuts to the people, let's assume that the marginal propensity to save, people save 10%. Right? The people are not going to go out and spend the exact $5. What they're going to do is they're going to save 10% of that. They're only going to spend 90%, which is $4.50. So to compensate for that, because there's a marginal propensity to save, we don't have this problem. We're talking about the government because in the aggregate demand curve, it's plus G, right? It's just G. What I mean by that, and this might make it clearer for people. All right, gross domestic product is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Let me make sure I'm sharing this. All right, G plus NX. This is what we learned before. C plus I plus G plus NX. What people buy, what businesses buy, including residential housing, what government buys, and exports. Now we have a new formula. GDP is going to be equal to consumption still, but now instead of just being consumption, we have a way to calculate it. It's going to be marginal propensity to consume times what people make minus what they pay in taxes. All right? Plus what they get in what we call transfers, plus what businesses invest, plus, and you know what? With this I, let me put in parentheses right here a little r. And what that little r means is that investment is impacted by interest rates. Here, how much people are, this is the whole consumption term. This term right here is the same thing as what we first learned in the previous chapter, which is consumption, right? This is how we calculate consumption. How much of your income, this is right here, this term, y minus t plus big T, with little t being taxes, big T being transfers, how much the government gives to you. This term right here is your disposable income. So how much of your disposable income do you actually spend, all right? Plus how much businesses spend, and that's impacted by interest rates, plus government spending, plus net exports. All right, so previously when we were talking about if we want to increase GDP, and remember here, GDP is just aggregate demand for this model, and we had to relax some of our assumptions. Before we said transfers didn't affect gross domestic product. Now in this new chapter, they do. Transfers make a difference. How much money the government gives you in transfers impacts how much you actually consume, which impacts the C. And remember, consumption is the largest portion of gross domestic product. Okay, so aggregate demand is now impacted by this. If we increase G, right, or I, the multiplier tells us that all we have to, are we have a money multiplier. In this example, we learned that because our marginal propensity to consume was 0.6, people spend 60% of what they earn. Then there is a 1 for 2.5. There's a 2.5 multiplier out there. For every dollar that we spend in government spending, you can expect the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right by $2.5. Getting back to taxes. All the book says is that when we give people a tax break to increase aggregate demand, increase GDP, not all of that money is going to be spent dollar for dollar. Right? So here we have to compensate. The formula book shows you. If the desired cut is in taxes, we take our desired fiscal stimulus, all right, which we just previously calculated, right? Before we calculated and said we need 160 of the fiscal stimulus, we have to divide it by the marginal propensity to consume. The reason we're dividing it again is because people don't spend everything, and we have to compensate. If people are saving 10% of their money, only spending 90%, we need to make sure that that desired fiscal stimulus is 10% larger, right? Do compensate for that. So what that means, if it was 160 before, and let's say 160 before, then if I go back to my desktop, and the formula says desired stimulus divided by MPC, we're going to take that 160, we're going to divide it by 0.6. When we divide it by 0.6, we find out it's 267.7, right, million or billion dollars that you'd have to give in tax breaks. So we're basically saying $160 in, let's say, government spending is equivalent to $267 in a tax cut. If we are trying to, remember, we can increase government spending or we can decrease taxes. And where I'm getting that from, let's see, is right. Let's go right here. I'm getting that from policy here, right? We're talking about fiscal policy. We can either increase government spending by 160, or we can lower taxes, but not by 160. We have to lower them more than we have to lower them by 160 divided by 0.6, which is actually 266.7, or we can increase transfers. So again, we have expansionary policy, contractionary. We have expansionary monetary policy, which are these four things right here. We have contractionary monetary policy, those four things. We have expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. Make sure you know the difference between all of them, and make sure specifically you know what happens when we buy bonds. That's going to ultimately shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and we know that the mechanism that kind of contains that, right? If this is the aggregate supply aggregate demand curve, okay, let me go ahead and label these again. This was our long run, right? We know it's completely vertical. Here's our short run aggregate supply and our aggregate demand curve. And on this axis, we have real GDP. And this is just a way that the government makes a model to figure out what happens. If we are economy is currently here, how can we get it over here? Well, we can practice expansionary monetary policy, right? We can buy bonds. We can lower the discount rate. We can lower the required reserve ratio, or we can lower the interest paid on reserves. Those are all going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Those are all monetary tools, all right? However, if we happen to be in a liquidity trap, right? And liquidity trap comes when you're talking about the money market. Here's the money demand curve. And sorry for the money demand curve, and here's the money supply curve. Right, this is a straight vertical line. Let me see if I can do this better. All right, the university is not open yet, so when I went in this morning, I couldn't get in. All right, this is the money demand curve. Here's the money supply curve, completely vertical. On this axis, you have the quantity of money, and you have the price of money, which is just interest rates. The price to borrow money is just the interest rate, right? So monetary policy would be anything that shifts the expansionary monetary policy, anything that shifts this money supply curve to the right. This is MS, and this is MD. All right, anything anything that shifts this to the right is going to lower, meaning that where this new curve intersects the money demand curve, that is the new interest rate. All right, this is how much money is going to be out in the economy, and this is the interest rate, which means that it will lower the interest rate. All right, this is expansionary monetary policy. If the Fed, let's say we were in an inflationary gap. Inflationary gap means that our current output is above our YF. Y1 is greater than YF. Then that means we need to practice contractionary monetary policy. We need to shift the curve instead of to the right, we need to shift it to the left. By shifting it to the left, what we end up with the new intersection of, let's say, MS, money supply curve 2, intersects the money demand curve, which means that the interest rate used to be R sub 1. Now the interest rate is R sub 2 up here. R2 is this point right here. All right, so when we decrease the money supply, let's say we decide to sell bonds. And when you sell bonds, it shrinks the money supply. That's going to increase the interest rates. When interest rates increase, it means that businesses are going to invest less, because what we learned in this next chapter is investment is the most volatile piece of GDP. And where I got that from, and sorry guys if I'm just reading to you here, I just want to point out a couple things in your book. Let's go to the course home. When you come down to this last chapter, I think it's might be here. There's a graph I wanted to point out. I'll probably be quicker. Let's see. This is talking about fiscal policy and interest rates. All right, and this is the terrible curve I was trying to draw basically, right? Here's the money supply curve, here's the money demand curve. I probably should have pointed that out as opposed to drawing them, right? Know why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. But what I'm trying to show you, and I may not be able to find it, is there was a graph which showed how interest rates and how investment fluctuates with GDP. And I may be in the wrong chapter. Short run fluctuations. Oh, guys, also, yeah. Make sure you watch these again right here. These are your lectures. I can't play them in the video here because they won't come through, the sound won't. You see where I've highlighted my notes? Demand curve. Okay, so I cannot find it. But what I wanted to show you was how there is a graph that shows shows GDP up and down, correct? But it breaks it down. I'll have to find it later rather than waste your time here. All right, but there was a graph that basically shows, the point I'm trying to make is GDP, fluctuations in gross domestic product, are up and down all over the place, right? Every year. However, there is this smooth trend is what the government's looking for. And what this is, let's say we have years on this axis. All right. 1991, 1992, 93, 94, 95. Here we have GDP. And every year, the boom and the bust. GDP goes up, it goes down. This would be a boom. This would be a recession. Remember, 2 consecutive periods of negative growth is considered a recession. But there is basically ran a regression line through here. The government would like to see slow, smooth growth, somewhere around 2%, right? In fact, they even target the federal funds rate. They increase the money supply by exactly 2%. But this GDP, what makes it so volatile, or what you can see prior to recession, is you will see that investment is the most volatile piece of GDP. And what I mean by that is an investment swings up and down wildly based on interest rates. So investment looks like all over the map, right? It really does. It goes up and down depending on what the interest rates are. And that is sort of a precursor to what the economy is going to be doing, because if businesses are not investing, then that means they're probably going to be firing later. When they are firing later, then you can expect to see consumers spend less. And remember, consumption is the largest part of GDP, about what, 2/3? And so people are going to be spending less money, which means gross domestic product is going to be falling. All right. And we're just talking about domestic people, all right, just US people. If we're worried about the rest of the world, we would be considering that into net exports. When the rest of the world is going through a recession, we're impacted by that also, simply because that's our NX. If people stop buying US goods outside of the United States, GDP is going to fall. All right, and that is it. Let me go back and look and see if I missed any other questions. All right, so please use that formula sheet. So explain our answers. Assume the government lowers income tax rates to eliminate recession. Will each of the following increase, decrease? So if they lower taxes, aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. All right, which is great because they're going to move out of the aggregate supply. The long run aggregate supply curve will not shift at all. The long run aggregate supply curve does not move because of changes in monetary policy or changes in fiscal policy. The long run aggregate supply curve, think of it like your PPF curve from before. And the book talks about the things that will move the long run aggregate supply curve. And I believe, if I am correct, hold on, okay, can I minimize this? Let's see, am I sharing my screen? All right, I may not have been sharing my screen there, sorry. And I forgot what I was going to say. Something about, oh, I completely forgot. Let's just go back, make sure I'm not missing anything on here. Let me just go back over this. Oh, the formula sheet, yes. So make sure that you've reviewed the formula sheet, and I sort of highlighted some of the formulas there. And so this is the formula sheet here. Put those ones in yellow. Also make sure that for the exam, let me share my desktop. All right, make sure you've watched those videos that are posted. This is what I was trying to remember. When you go into course materials, these videos explain, here's what I was talking about, what moves the curves in here. This is nothing more than me copying, pasting right off the book, all right? And so we're talking about what moves the long run aggregate supply curve, all right? This talks about why the short run aggregate supply curve, what my aggregate demand curve moves, all right? In the same section, this is right out the book. Just go make sure you have this ready. Talks about what moves the long run aggregate supply curve. Something that's going to move the long run aggregate supply curve are going to be things that can affect the PPF curve, like an increase in immigration. I'd say people become brighter and smarter, right? These things are going to shift the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. Right, that is it. If anyone has any other questions about the extra credit, let me know. I'm going to post those points. I've already posted them, but I just want to put this video up because I'm still waiting on 2 more. I will go ahead and publish those extra credit points up to 10 points on exam 3. Thanks so much.